Hello, and thank you for joining us on Ask a Historian. I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. Each week we invite you to send in your questions, and we will have a fascinating time exploring the story of Mississauga together. Are there things that you're curious about? Are there people or events from our collective past that you've wanted to explore and learn more of? Have you ever wondered about the origin or meaning of a place name, a road name, or even a park name on our landscape? We look forward to exploring the stories of Mississauga with you. For this week's episode of Ask a Historian, we focus on a few inquiries we received over the last couple of weeks. This is a fascinating way to explore the things that are curious to people in the city of Mississauga. So please keep sending in your questions. Thank you, Ashley, for your question. And it's not a straightforward one to answer, as many of our questions are not. The first community center built by Mississauga in Mississauga is the Burnhamthorpe Community Center, which was conceived in 1971 and 72 with groundbreaking in December of 1972. And it was opened as a facility to the public in 1974. So that's the Burnhamthorpe Community Center. It was planned and built by the town of Mississauga and opened by the city of Mississauga. But it is not the oldest community center in Mississauga today, and that's a part or a story of amalgamation and kind of the evolution of our city. The precursor to the town of Mississauga, of course, was Toronto Township. And Toronto Township built a recreation center in 1967. And between 1965 and 67, it opened officially on September 21st, 1967. It was first called the Huron Park Recreation Center, now known as Huron Park Community Center. And again, that was planned and built by Toronto Township. So Huron Park is older than the Burnhamthorpe Community Center. But older even than Huron Park is one built by the town of Streetsville in Streetsville today. It was originally built as an arena, Vic Johnson Arena, and has now been expanded over the years, and it is known as Vic Johnson Community Center. It was first opened in 1961. So that is our oldest community center. So we have three historic community centers, if you will. The first one in the city of Mississauga is Burnhamthorpe Community Center in 1974. It was predated by Huron Park Recreation Center, now Huron Park Community Center, which opened in 1967, which in turn was predated by Vic Johnson Arena, now Vic Johnson Community Center, which was opened in 1961. However, they are not the oldest public recreation facilities in our community. Port Credit Arena was opened on October 4th, 1959 by the town of Port Credit. And the former Malton Arena, now the Paul Coffey Arena, was opened in Malton in 1968 by Toronto Township, or then in the early days of the town of Mississauga. So again, there are several old and well-entrenched, well-loved recreational facilities in our community, but specific to your question about community centers, the oldest in order are Vic Johnson, 1961, originally in the town of Streetsville, and Huron Park Community Center, built by Toronto Township, opening in 1967, followed by Burnhamthorpe Community Center, built by the town of Mississauga and opened in the city of Mississauga in 1974. So Ashley, thank you for your question. Always fun exploring the different facets of our story together. Our second question this week is from Carter, and asking about who was the first non-Indigenous person to receive a property and build a farm here in Mississauga. It's a bit of a trick question, but thank you. It's fun kind of looking back in time and looking at property and property records and the like and trying to make sense of who came and where they came from and who was with them in terms of family and what those early steps on our landscape would have been as it evolved into an agricultural landscape. But again, a bit of a trick question because there's not a clean answer to it. The first non-Indigenous person recorded as being given a land grant here in historic Mississauga was Sir Samuel Smith. He received a land grant on August 11th of 1806. But Samuel Smith did not live here. He owned land along the border of the Etobicoke Creek, a little bit like a land speculator, although he lived on the Etobicoke side. Colonel Sam Smith Park is named for Samuel Smith. He was also a government land agent. So although he's the first to receive a land grant here, by what we know of it, and he did not make improvements here, nor did he live here, rather held on to the land, just kind of abutting the Etobicoke Creek in our southeast side of corner of Mississauga, and received it in 1806. So we kind of, although that is the first land grant, kind of put him out of our mind in terms of making improvements and living on the land. When asked this question, normally, and it has come up before, we usually point to a land grant that was issued on May 19th of 1807 to Sarah Grant. Yes, our first kind of someone who would be resident or at least transfer land and start the path towards a settled landscape was a woman who lived in York, what is now Toronto, and she received a land grant on Lot 10, Concession 1, South Dundas Street on May 19th of 1807. In today's terms, that land grant, which was a 200-acre parcel of land, was on the south side of Dundas Street at the foot of Cawthra Road, roughly between Cawthra and Haynes Road today. However, she was never to live here and actually only owned the property for 8 days. Very quickly after acquiring the property, 8 days later, her husband, Amasa Grant, sold the property to Philip Cody. And Philip Cody would receive some accolades here as a very early settler. He established Cody's Tavern, made improvements on his property, and was also served in the War of 1812 and is noted as the grandfather to the famed Buffalo Bill Cody of the American West. And so Philip Cody purchased Sarah Grant's land grant here on May 26th of 1807. So that's kind of where we point to the kind of the first directions, but it doesn't entirely answer your question. Again, the Grants never lived here, although despite they did receive a very early land grant. Another possible way to answer your question is trying to identify the first person to actually live, first non-Indigenous person to actually live here in historic Mississauga. Of course, we can wander down the road of Indigenous history with other ways we look at the early years of our community and people that interacted with this landscape. But since your question was specific to kind of the farming agricultural landscape and non-Indigenous settlement, we'll focus on that. The Government Inn was a government building that was established at the mouth of the Credit River in 1798. It was the first, use the term European or colonial building to be built in what is now Mississauga. And it was established in 1798. The first lease of the Government Inn was given to William Allen of York. York is now Toronto. He was a prominent Scottish-born York merchant, although he himself most likely never lived here. He may have visited, but we do not believe that he lived at the Government Inn. He had many government appointments, postmaster, customs agent, and the like, and just one of them happened to be holding the lease of the Government Inn, and one of his responsibilities was to appoint an innkeeper. And it is the innkeeper who likely lived in the inn along with his family. And we have a lot of stories of early innkeepers. But the very first one likely to have lived here was by the name of John Coon, who was the innkeeper and resided at the Government Inn between 1798 and 1801. We don't know very much of his family. We know that he's listed with a wife there. Her name was Elizabeth, so John and Elizabeth Coon. They were followed as innkeepers at the Government Inn by Benjamin Gilbert, who served between 1801 and 1803, John Kendrick from 1803 to 1804, and then followed by Major Thomas Ingersoll in 1805. And Thomas Ingersoll lived and ran the inn between 1805 and 1812, just passing away on the eve of the War of 1812. Major Ingersoll was probably most well remembered for being the father of famed Canadian heroine Laura Secord. And so, yes, Laura Secord's father of Laura Secord, of course, of the walk fame during the War of 1812. Her father was the proprietor of the Government Inn in what is now Port Credit. So those are the early families. So quite possibly we could point to John Coon and his wife Elizabeth as being the first people who lived at the Government Inn and lived in historic Mississauga that were not Indigenous people. However, it doesn't entirely answer your question. I apologize, we're waffling a bit before we come to maybe a conclusive answer here, or as conclusive as we can be. The second part of your question dealt with who established a farm here, and I think maybe that's more a focal point of what you're wondering about, is who lived here and who stayed here and set up a farm here that would pass down and be in occupation for years to come. We don't know with certainty, but let me walk you through kind of our supposition on this answer. There were several land grants issued in November and December of 1807. These are very early land grants. They followed just on the heels of only a couple others that predated them, including Samuel Smith and Sarah Grant. But in November and December of 1807, about 15 land grants were issued. Some along Dundas Street, around Cawthron and Dixie Roads, a number of others down in what is now the Clarkson area of Mississauga and the southwest of Mississauga. What we surmise, given the dates of those land grants, is very unlikely that people came in that type of in the winter, in November and December, to take up their land occupation, because among the things that you have to do was clear land, have a shelter, a cabin built, have crop under cultivation, etc. There's no social security or assistance for these people, and so it's very unlikely that, even though they've been given a land grant in November and December of 1807, very unlikely that they took it up during the winter months. We surmise, and borne out with some documentation, that those people who received those land grants took up their land in the spring of the following year, so in the spring of 1808. And that's when we likely can start to say with some confidence that we have people on the ground making improvements to their land in the spring of 1808. Among those people who received those land grants in November and December of 1807 and likely took up their property in the spring of 1808 were individuals like Joseph Silverthorne, Daniel House, John Jones, Peter Wright, John Gage, William Jennings, Alan Robinette, Paul Marion, Thomas Williams, William Barber, John Steele, Conrad Shane, Othniel Smith, and John Utter. But the first to receive his land title, not his land grant, but his land title. His land title is issued once the improvements have been made and the fence viewer can verify that he has fulfilled his settlement obligations, or settlement duties as they refer to, which were building a house, having land cleared, having a crop under cultivation, having his cleared portion of land fenced, and having his road allotments that abutted his property cleared. And so the first person to noted, or that we've made note of, to receive their land title was that of Henry Gable. And he received his land grant on December 19th of 1807 and was likely on the ground on his property in the early spring of 1808. His land was in the very southwest corner of our city, near what is now Lakeshore Road and Winston Churchill Boulevard, our extreme southwest corner. We do not have evidence to say that Gable was the first, but he was the first that we know of to complete his settlement duties and have his farm established, and therefore likely one of the first on the ground to begin making those improvements, or what was termed by the government at the time as improvements, those settlement duties. So again, not a clear and fast answer to you, but a number of ways to look at it. But we usually point to Henry Henry Gable as being the first, or certainly amongst the very first settlers to establish a farm here in historic Mississauga. So thank you for your question. Our final question this week comes from Craig, and asking about the history of a little street in kind of west central Mississauga known as Pickmere Court. And I wish I had an answer for what the name origin of the street was. I haven't been able to discern that, but from a little kind of a property history, if you will, to give you set the stage for what would become the modern subdivision that is on Pykmir Court. The property itself was originally part of a 200-acre land grant issued to Absalom Wilcox in February of 1811. Now, Absalom Wilcox has a fascinating story in our history. He's referred to in our local published histories as the worthy settler, and he was called as such by rebel leader William Lyon Mackenzie during the rebellion of 1837. Absalom Wilcox had a long life. He was involved in the building of Dixie Union Chapel. He was one of the first trustees there. His son Daniel served in the rebellion with alongside William Lyon Mackenzie, was one of the rebels. Absalom himself is buried at Dixie Union Cemetery. Now, Absalom only owned the property for a short period of time, or at least the property where Pykmir Court is today, because although he was granted 200 acres, he only chose to retain the south 100 acres. So very quickly on, only 6 days after acquiring the full 200-acre land, he sold off the northern 87 acres to Levi Lewis on February 28th of 1811. So the 87 acres on the north side of the property, which include the very northern end, which is where Pykmir Court is today, was sold to Levi Lewis in 1811. There is no evidence to say that Levi Lewis made improvements. In fact, although he held the property for 30 years, it seems like it was likely more speculation, because when he went to sell the property in 1844, there was very little increase in value on the property. The property was sold in 1844 to Daniel Custod, and we can say with certainty that the Custods are the ones who started to make improvements on the property. Daniel's son, James Custod, who was married into the Silverthorne family, or related to them by marriage, he certainly is living here, and there's a house on the property and a barn established and the like. So this is a farm property under the Custod family. And it remained in the Custod family until 1891. From James Custod, it was willed to Alice Custod. And we're not entirely certain at this point yet if Alice is the daughter or wife of James Custod, but nonetheless, it's left to her in 1869 and remains in her property until 1891. In 1891, the property was sold to Pearson Wells. We don't know much about Pearson Wells, but the property was subject to a court case between Pearson Wells, who was listed as a defendant, and Catherine Wells, who was listed as the plaintiff in 1901. I wish we had more information on that, but at the moment we do not. We just have record a court case took place. It appears that whatever the case was about, it was found in favor of the defendant, because Pearson Wells continued to own the property until 1927, when it was sold to William Winter. William Winter transferred the property to his daughter Clara Winter in 1963, and in 1965 it was transferred again to Westmoreland Holdings Limited. That is 1965 Westmoreland Holdings Limited, who commenced laying out the subdivision plan. And this includes Pykmir Court today, and an aerial photography of 1966 shows the development of that subdivision, including Pykmir Court, is underway at that time. And so there's your history. Kind of the subdivision begins in 1965-66, and that bears out not only in the property records with the transfer to Westmoreland's Holding Limited, but also in the aerial photography that shows the construction underway and not yet complete in 1966. So, Craig, hopefully that answers some of your questions. If we haven't hit on everything, please shoot us another line, and happy to explore some more, particularly if you want to jump into some of the previous landowners and learn more about who lived there and kind of where their properties were located and the like. So quite happy to explore the history of the city and your area together. So thank you very much for sending in the question. Thank you for joining us this week again on Ask a Historian, and it's always a fun way to learn more about our city by exploring our past. So please keep sending in your questions, and we will explore the fascinating story of our city together.